Another. A third lost its head to an arrow of fire and an explosion of boiled blood and flesh, but that one rode on, waving its sword, as if it did not know it was dead. Rand was seeking them out. If the Murdrawl were all killed, the Trollocs might well was dead. Rand was seeking them out. If the Murdrawl were all killed, the Trollocs might well turn and run. Death gates and arrows of fire only, Lews Theron spun now. The massive Trollocs was too close to the manor house for blossoms of fire. Some of the Ashaman apparently did not realize that right away. The room shook to great booms. The whole manor house shook, as if struck by huge sledgehammers, shook as though about to shake apart. And then there were no more explosions, except where a fireball erupted, or the ground itself exploded to throw Trollocs like broken toys. The sky seemed to rain lightning. Silver blue bolts struck continuously so close to the house that the hair on Rand's arms and chest tried to lift, the hair on his head. Some of the Trollocs succeeded in forcing open the doors to one of the barns and began flooding inside. He shifted his hands, cutting down those still outside with flickering red filaments that blew holes in them. Some had managed to get inside, but those the Saldaeans would have to deal with themselves. On another barn and a stable, flames were beginning to ripple up the thatch, men coughing from the acrid smoke as they shot their bows. "Listen to me, Lews Theron. The fire. You must do something." Lews Theron said nothing, just spun his webs to kill Trollocs and Murdrawl. "Logain!" Rand shouted. "The fires! Put them out!" The other man did not answer either, but Rand saw the weaves that pulled the heat from the flames, killing them. They just vanished, leaving behind cold, blackened thatch where not even tendrils of smoke rose. Death walked among the Trollocs, but they were so close that even the explosions of fireballs rattled the house now. Suddenly there was a Murdrawl afoot beside the window, pale eyeless face as calm as an Aes Sedai's, black sword already stabbing toward him. Two thrown Aiel spears took it in the chest, and a throwing knife blossomed in its throat, but it only staggered before resuming the thrust. Rand bunched his fingers together, and just before the blade reached him, 100 arrows of fire ripped through the Murdrawl, flinging it back 20 paces to lie riddled and leaking black blood onto the ground. Murdrawl seldom died right away, but this one never twitched. Hurriedly, Rand searched for more targets, but he realized that Lews Theron had stopped channeling. He could still feel the goosebumps that told him Cadsuane and Olivia held the power, still feel Sayadine and Logain, but the other man was weaving no more webs either. Outside, the ground lay carpeted with bodies and parts of bodies from the fields almost to the manor house walls. Within paces of them, a few horses belonging to Murdrawl still stood, one holding up a foreleg as if it were broken. A headless Murdrawl staggered about, flailing wildly with its sword, and here and there a Trolloc jerked or tried to lift itself and failed, but nothing else moved. "It's done," he thought. "It's done, Lews Theron. You can release Sayadine now." Arlen and Delilah were standing on the table, veiled and spears in hand. Min stood beside them, her face grim, a throwing knife in either hand. The bond was full of fear, and not for herself, he suspected. They had saved his life, but he had to save it himself now. "A close run thing," Logain muttered. "If this had happened before I arrived. A close run thing." He gave himself a shake and released the source, turning away from his glassless window. "Did you intend keeping these new weaves for your favorites like Taim? Those gateways. Where did we send those Trollocs? I just copied your weave exactly." "It doesn't matter where they went," Rand said absently. His attention was focused on Lews Theron. The madman, the bloody voice in his head, drew a little deeper on the power. "Let go, man. Shadow spawn can't survive passing through a gateway." "I want to die," Lews Theron said. "I want to join you." "You wanted to die? Why did you kill Trollocs?" Rand thought. "Why kill that Murdrawl?" He People will find groups of dead Trollocs and maybe Myrtle without a mark on them, he said aloud. I seem to remember dying, Luce Theron murmured. I remember how I did it. He drew deeper still, and small pains grew in Rand's temples. Not too many in any one place, though. The destination shifts every time a death gate opens. Rand rubbed at his temples. That pain was a warning. He was close to the amount of Sayadine he could hold without dying or being burnt out. You can't die yet, he told Luce Theron. We have to reach Tarmangaiden or the world dies. A death gate, Logan said, his voice tinged with distaste. Why are you still holding the power? He asked suddenly. And so much. If you're trying to show me that you're stronger than I am, I already know it. I saw how large your death gates were compared to mine. And I'd say you're holding every drop of Sayadine that you can safely. That certainly caught everyone's attention. Min tucked her knives away and leapt down from the table, the bond suddenly so full of fear it seemed to throb with it. Ara and Delilah exchanged worried glances, then went back to staring out the windows. They did not trust Trollocs to be dead until the corpses were 3 days buried. Olivia took a step toward him, frowning, but he shook his head slightly, and she turned back to her window, though her frown remained. Cadswain glided down the room, her smooth face sternly composed. What does he feel? She demanded of Min. Don't toy with me, girl. You know the cost of that. I know that he bonded you, and you know I know. Is he afraid? He's never afraid, Min said. Except for me, or... She set her jaw stubbornly and folded her arms beneath her breasts, fixing Cadswain with a glare that dared the Green Sister to do her worst. By the tangled mix of emotions ranging from fear to shame that she tried to keep out of the bond and failed, she had some idea of what Cadswain's worst could be. I'm standing under your nose, Rand said. If you want to know how I feel, ask me. Luce Theron, he thought. There was no answer, and the Sayadine filling him did not slacken. His temples began to throb. Well, Cadswain said impatiently, I feel right as well, Water. Luce Theron. But I have a rule for you, Cadswain. Don't threaten Min again. In fact, leave her alone altogether. Well, the boy shows some teeth. Golden birds and fish, stars and moons, swayed as she shook her head. Just don't show too many. And you might ask the young woman whether she wants your protection. Strangely, Min had shifted her frown to him, and the bond was threaded with irritation. Light, it was bad enough that she did not like him worrying about her. Now she seemed to want to take on Cadswain single-handed, something he would not be eager to do himself. We can die at Tarmangaiden, Luce Theron said, and suddenly the power drained out of him. Be released, Logan said, as if he were suddenly on Cadswain's side. I know, she told him. He whipped his head around in surprise. Min can deal with you in your own way if she wishes, Rand said, starting for the door. But don't threaten her. Yes, he thought. We can down at Tarmangaiden. Chapter 20. The Golden Crane. The wind had died away as the rain diminished, but gray clouds still hid the sun. The fine drizzle was enough to dampen Rand's hair, however, and begin soaking into his gold-embroidered black coat as he walked through the dead Trollocs. Logain had spun a shield of air so that raindrops bounced from it, or apparently slid down nothing to cascade around him. But Rand refused to risk Luce Theron seizing Sayadine again. The man had said he could wait until the last battle to die, but how far could you trust a madman on anything? Madman, Luce Theron whispered. Am I any better than you? He cackled with wild laughter. Now and then, Nandera looked over her shoulder at Rand. A tall, sinewy woman, her graying hair hidden beneath her brown shufa. She led the maidens, those on this side of the dragon wall at least, but she had chosen to lead his bodyguard of maidens personally. Her green eyes, all he could see of her sun-dark face above her black veil, carried little expression, yet he was sure she was worried over him not protecting himself from the rain. Maidens noticed what seemed out of the ordinary. He hoped she would keep quiet. "You trust me," Luz Theron said. "Trust me. Oh, Light, I'm pleading with a voice in my head. I must be mad." And Dara and the rest of the 50 veiled maidens made a large ring around Rand, almost shoulder to shoulder, prodding their spears into every Trolloc and Murdral they passed, casually stepping over huge severed arms and legs, severed heads, bearing horns or tusks or sharp teeth. Occasionally a Trolloc groaned or feebly tried to crawl away, or to lunge at them, snarling, but not for long. War with Trollocs was like war with rabid dogs. You killed them or they killed you. There was no parley, no surrender, no middle ground. Rain had kept the vultures away so far, yet crows and ravens flapped everywhere, black feathers glistening wetly, and if any were the Dark One's eyes, it did not stop them alighting to pluck out Trolloc's eyes, or see whether they could wrench loose some other gobbet. Enough of the Trollocs had been torn apart that the birds had rich feasting. None went near any dead Murdral, though, and they shunned Trollocs too near a Murdral. That indicated nothing beyond caution. Very likely the Murdral smelled wrong to the birds. A Murdral's blood would etch steel if left on it very long. To ravens it must have smelled like poison. The surviving Saldeans shot the birds with arrows or skewered them on their sinuously curved swords, or simply bludgeoned them with shovels or hoes or rakes, anything that could make a handy club. In the borderlands, leaving a crow or raven alive was unthinkable. There, they were all too often the Dark One's eyes. Yet there were too many. Hundreds of black-feathered shapes lay crumpled among the Trollocs, and for every corpse there seemed to be hundreds more squabbling loudly over the softer bits and gooding pieces of their dead fellows. The Ashaman and Aes Sedai had long since given up trying to kill them all. "I don't like my men tiring themselves this way," Loghain said. His men. Other sisters, for that matter. Gabrella and Tovann will be near exhaustion by nightfall. He had bonded the two Aes Sedai, so he should know. What if there's another attack? All around the manor house and outbuildings, brief fires flared, so hot that people shielded their eyes against them, as Aes Sedai and Ashaman incinerated Trolloc and Murdral dead where they lay. There were too many to afford the labor of gathering them into heaps. With fewer than 20 Aes Sedai, fewer than a dozen Ashaman, and maybe 100,000 Trollocs, it was going to be a long job. Very likely, before it was done, the stench of decay would be added to the already foul odors in the air, the fetid coppery smell of shadow-spawn blood, the stink of whatever had been in the Trollocs' intestines when they were ripped open. Best not to think too closely on that. There might not be a farmer or villager left alive between the manor house and the spine of the world. That had to be where the Trollocs had come from, the waygate outside Steading Shangtai. At least Loyal's home itself was safe. Neither Trollocs nor Murdral would enter a steading unless driven, and it required considerable driving. "Would you rather let them rot where they are?" Cadsuane inquired, sounding as if she herself had no preference in the matter. She held her green skirts up so the silk did not trail in the blood-soaked mud or the offal that littered the ground, yet she stepped over legs and around heads as casually as did the maidens. She also had woven a parasol against the rain, as had Olivia, although not until she saw the green do so. Rand had tried to make the sisters sworn to him teach the Seanchan woman more about the power, but to their minds that had nothing to do with their oaths of fealty. She was safe to herself and seemed safe to others, and they were content to leave matters as they were. Nynaeve had refused too, because of Min's viewing. Cadsuane had coolly informed him that she was not in the business of instructing wilders. "This truly would be a charnel house then," Min said. Her walk had a fetching sway to it, though she was plainly trying not to think of what lay underfoot while avoiding planting a heeled blue boot on any of it at the same time, and that made her stumble now and again. She was getting wet, too, her ringlets beginning to cling to her head, though the bond carried no hint of vexation, only anger, and that seemed directed at Logain from the sharp stare she was giving him. Where would the servants go, and the people who worked the fields and stables and barns? How would they live? There won't be another attack, Rand said. Not until whoever sent this one learns it failed. And maybe not then. This is all they sent. The Murdraw wouldn't have attacked piecemeal. Logain grunted, but he could not argue with that. Rand looked back toward the manor house. In some places, dead Trollocs lay right at the foundations. None had made it inside, but Logain was right, he thought, surveying the carnage. It had been a close-run thing. Minus the Ashaman and the Aes Sedai Logain had brought, the end might well have been different. A very close-run thing. And if there was another attack later? Plainly someone knew Ishamael's trick, or that blue-eyed man in his head really could locate him. Another attack would be larger, that or come from some unexpected direction. Perhaps he should let Logain bring a few more Ashaman.
You should have killed them.
Lews Therin wept.
Too late now, too late.
The source is clean now, fool, Rand thought. Yes, Lews Therin replied. But are they?
Am I?
Rand had wondered that about himself. Half of the double wound in his side had come from Ishamael, the other half from Potton Fane's dagger that carried the taint of Shada Logoth. They often throbbed, and when they did, they seemed alive. The circle of maidens parted slightly to let through a white-haired serving man with a long, sharp nose who looked even frailer than Ethan. He was trying to shelter beneath a two-tiered seafolk parasol missing half its fringe, of all things, but the aged blue silk had several ragged holes worn in it, so small rivulets fell on his yellow coat and one on his head. His thinning hair clung to his skull and dripped. He seemed wetter than if he had gone without. Doubtless one of Elgaren's forebears had obtained the thing somehow as a memento, but the obtaining must have been a story in itself. Rand doubted the seafolk gave up a clan wave mistress's parasol lightly.
My lord dragon,
the old man said with a bow that spilled more water down his back.
Baron Sedai instructed me to give this to you straight away.
From beneath his coat he produced a paper, folded and sealed. Rand hastily stuffed it into a pocket of his own coat against the rain. Ink ran easily. Thank you, but it could have waited till I returned to the house. Best you get back inside before you're soaked through completely.
She did say straight away, my lord dragon.
The fellow sounded offended.
She is Aes Sedai.
At Rand's nod, he bowed again and started slowly back toward the manor house, his back stiff with pride, the parasol showering streams of water. She was Aes Sedai. Everyone hopped for Aes Sedai, even in Tyr, where they were not much liked. What did Varen have to say that she needed to put in a letter? Thumbing the seal, Rand walked on. His destination was one of the barns, its thatched roof partially blackened. This was the barn the Trollocs had gotten into. A burly fellow, in a rough brown coat and muddy boots, leaning against a jamb in the open doors, straightened and for some reason hastily looked inside over his shoulder as Rand approached, the maidens spreading out to surround the barn. He stopped dead in the doorway, Min and the others halting beside him. Logain groaned and oathed. A pair of lanterns hanging from uprights that supported the loft gave a dim light, enough to see that every single surface was thick with crawling flies, even the straw-covered dirt floor. As many more buzzed around in the air, it seemed. Where did they come from? Rand asked. Elgaren might not be wealthy, yet his barns and stables were kept as clean as such places could be. The burly man gave a guilty start. He was younger than most of the servants in the house, but his head was bald halfway back, and creases bracketed his wide mouth, fanned out from his eyes. Don't know, my lord. he muttered, knuckling his forehead with a grimy hand. He focused on Rand so hard that it was plain he did not want to look into the barn. I stepped to the door for a breath of fresh, and when I turned around, they was all over everything. I thought maybe these dead flies. Rand shook his head in disgust. These flies were all too alive. Not every Saldean defending this barn had died, but all of the Saldean dead had been gathered here. Saldeans disliked burials in rain. None of them could say why, but you just did not bury people while it was raining. 19 men lay in a neat row on the floor, as neat as it could be when some were missing limbs or had their heads split open. But they had been laid out carefully by their friends and companions, their faces washed, their eyes closed. They were why he had come here, not to say goodbye or anything sentimental. He had not known any of these men more than to recognize a face here and there. He had come to remind himself that even what seemed a complete victory had its cost in blood. Still, they deserved better than to be crawling with flies. I need no reminders, Luce Theron growled. I'm not you, Rand thought. I have to harden myself. Logain, get rid of these bloody things, he said aloud. You're harder than I ever was, Luce Theron said. Suddenly he giggled. If you're not me, then who are you? Now I'm a flaming fly whisk, he muttered. Rand rounded on him angrily, but Olivia spoke in that slurred drawl before he could get a word out. Let me try, my lord, she asked in a manner of speaking, but like an Aes Sedai, she did not wait for permission. His skin tingled with goosebumps as she embraced Sayadar and channeled. Flies always took shelter from even the lightest rain because one raindrop was enough to put a fly in the ground, easy prey until its wings dried off. Yet suddenly the doorway was billowing with buzzing flies as if the rain were far preferable to the barn. The air seemed solid with them. Rand batted flies away from his face, and Min covered her face with her hands, the bond heavy with distaste, but they were interested only in flight. In moments, they were all gone. The balding man, staring at Olivia with his mouth hanging open, suddenly coughed and spat out 2 flies onto his hand. Cadswain gave him a look that snapped his mouth shut and sent his rough knuckle flying to his forehead. Just a look, yet she was who she was. So you watch, she said to Olivia. Her dark eyes were fixed on the Shongshan woman's face, but Olivia did not start or stammer. She was much less impressed by Aes Sedai than most people. And remember what I see. I must learn somehow if I am to help the Lord Dragon. I have learned more than you are aware of. Min made a sound in her throat, very nearly a growl, and the bond swelled with anger, but the yellow-haired woman ignored her. You are not angry with me? She asked Rand, her voice anxious. I'm not angry. Learn as much as you can. You're doing very well. She blushed and dropped her eyes like a girl startled by an unexpected compliment. Fine lines decorated the corners of her eyes, but sometimes it was hard to remember that she was 100 years older than any living Aes Sedai, rather than half a dozen years younger than himself. He had to find someone to teach her more. Randall Thor, Min said angrily, folding her arms beneath her breasts. You are not going to let that woman... Your viewings are never wrong, he broke in. What you see always happens. You've tried to change things and it never worked. You told me so yourself, Min. What makes you think this time can be different? Because it has to be different, she told him fiercely. She leaned toward him as though ready to launch herself at him. Because I want it to be different. Because it will be different. Anyway, I don't know about everything I've seen. People move on. I was wrong about Moraine. I saw all sorts of things in her future, and she's dead. Maybe some of the other things I saw never came true either. It must not be different this time, Luce Theron panted. You promised. A faint scowl appeared on Logain's face, and he shook his head slightly. He could not like hearing men question her ability. Rand almost regretted telling him about her viewing of him, though it had seemed harmless encouragement at the time. The man had actually asked Aes Sedai to confirm Min's ability, though he had been wise enough to try to keep his doubting from Rand. I cannot see what makes this young woman so vehement for you, boy, Cadsuane mused. She pursed her lips and thawed, then shook her head, ornaments swaying. Oh, you're pretty enough, I suppose, but I just cannot see it. To avoid another argument with Min, she did not call them that, she called them talking, but he knew the difference. Rand took out Varen's letter and broke the blob of yellow sealing wax impressed with the head of a great serpent ring. The Brown sister's spidery hand covered most of the page, a few letters blotted where raindrops had soaked the paper. He walked closer to the nearest lantern. It gave off a faint stink of spoiled oil. As I said, I have done what I can do here. I believe that I can fulfill my oath to you better elsewhere, so I have taken Tomos and gone to be about it. There are many ways to serve you, after all, and many needs. I am convinced that you can trust Cadsuane, and you certainly should heed her advice. But be wary of other sisters, including those who have sworn fealty to you. Such an oath means nothing to a black sister, and even those who walk in the light may interpret it in ways you would disapprove of. You already know that few see that oath as invoking absolute obedience in all things. Some may find other holds. So whether or not you follow Cadsuane's advice, and I repeat that you should, follow mine. Be very wary. It was signed simply Varen. He grunted sourly. Few thought the oath meant absolute obedience. It was more like none. They obeyed, usually, yet the letter was not always the spirit. Take Varen herself. She warned him against the others doing things he might disapprove of, but she had not said where she was going or what she intended to do there. Was she afraid he might not approve? Maybe it was just Aes Sedai concealment. Sisters kept secrets as naturally as they breathed. When he held out the letter to Cadsuane, her left eyebrow twitched slightly. She must have been truly startled to show so much, but she took the letter and held it where the lantern's light illuminated it. A woman of many masks, she said finally, handing the page back. But she gives good advice here. What did she mean by masks? He was about to ask her when Loyal and Elder Hammond suddenly appeared in the doorway, each carrying a long-handled axe with an ornately decorated head on his shoulder. The white-haired Ogier's tufted ears were laid back, his face grim, and Loyal's ears were flickering. With excitement, Rand guessed. It could be difficult to tell.
I trust we are not interrupting, Elder Hammond said, his ears rising as he looked sadly at the line of bodies.
You are not, Rand told him, sticking the letter back in his pocket. I wish I could come to your wedding, Loyal, but...
Oh, that's done, Rand,
Loyal said. He must be excited. It was unlike him to interrupt.
My mother insisted. There won't even be time for much of a wedding feast, maybe none. What with the stump and me having to...
The older Ogier laid a hand on his arm.
What?
Loyal said, looking at him.
Oh, yes, of course. Well...
He scrubbed under his broad nose with a finger the size of a fat sausage. Something he was not supposed to be told? Even Ogier had secrets, it seemed. Rand fingered the letter in his pocket. But then so did everyone else.
I promise you this, Rand,
Loyal said.
Whatever happens, I will be there with you at Tarmangaiden. Whatever happens. My boy,
Elder Hammond murmured.
I don't think you should...
He trailed off, shaking his head and rumbling under his breath like a distant earthquake. Rand crossed the straw in 3 strides and offered his right hand. Smiling widely, and with an Ogier that meant very wide, Loyal took it in a hand that enveloped his. This close, Rand had to crane his neck to look up at his friend's face. Thank you, Loyal. I can't tell you how much hearing that means to me. But I'll need you before then.
You... need me?
Loyal, I've sealed the way gates I know in Camelin and Kyrian, Ilion and Tyr, and I put a very nasty trap on the one that was cut open near Faldara. But I couldn't find the one near Farmatting. Even when I know there's a way gate actually in a city, I can't find it by myself. And then there are all those cities that don't exist anymore. I need you to find the rest for me, Loyal, or Trollocs will be able to flood into every country at once. And no one will know they're coming until they're in the heart of Andor or Kyrian. Loyal's smile vanished. His ears trembled and his eyebrows drew down till the ends lay on his cheeks.
I can't, Rand,
He said mournfully.
I must leave first thing tomorrow morning, and I don't know when I'll be able to come outside again.
I know you've been out of the steading a long time, Loyal. Rand tried to make his voice gentle, but it came out hard. Gentleness seemed a fading memory. I'll speak to your mother. I'll convince her to let you leave after you've had a little rest.
He needs more than a little rest.
Elder Hammond planted the butt of his axe haft on the floor, gripping the axe with both hands, and directed a stern look at Rand. Ogier were peaceful people, yet he looked anything but.
He has been outside more than 5 years. Far too long. He needs weeks of rest in a steading at the least. Months would be better. My mother doesn't make those decisions anymore, Rand. Though truth to tell, I think she's still surprised to realize it. Aerith does. My wife.
His booming voice put so much pride into that word that he seemed ready to burst with it. His chest certainly swelled, and his smile split his face in two. And I haven't even congratulated you, Rand said, clapping him on the shoulder. His attempt at heartiness sounded false in his own ears, but it was the best he could manage. If you need months, then months you shall have. But I still need an Ogier to find those way gates. In the morning I'll take you all to Steading Shangtai myself. Maybe I can convince someone there to do the job. Elder Hammond shifted his frown to his hands on the axe haft, and began muttering again, too softly to make out words, like a bumblebee the size of a huge mastiff, buzzing in an immense jar in the next room. He seemed to be arguing with himself.
That might take time, Loyal said doubtfully. You know we don't like to make hasty decisions. I'm not certain they will even let a human into the steading because of the stump. Rand, if I can't come back before the last battle, you will answer my questions about what happened while I was in the steading, won't you? I mean, without making me drag everything out of you.
If I can, I will, Rand told him. If you can, Luce Theron snarled. You agreed we could finally die at Tarmangaiden. You agreed, madman. He'll answer your questions to your heart's delight, Loyal, Min said firmly, if I have to stand over him the whole while. Anger suffused the bond. She really did seem to know what he was thinking. Elder Hammond cleared his throat.
It seems to me that I myself am more accustomed to outside than almost anyone except the stonemasons. Um, yes. In fact, I think I am likely to be the best candidate for your task.
Faugh, Catswain said. It seems you infect even Ogier, boy. Her tone was stern, but her face was all Aes Sedai composure, unreadable, hiding whatever was passing behind those dark eyes. Loyal's ears went rigid with shock, and he almost dropped his axe, fumbling to catch it.
You? But the stump, Elder Hammond, the great stump. I believe I can safely leave that in your hands, my boy. Your words were simple yet eloquent. Uh, my advice is don't try for beauty. Keep the simple eloquence, and you may surprise quite a few, including your mother.
It seemed impossible that Loyal's ears could grow any stiffer, but they did. His mouth moved, but no words came out. So he was to speak to the stump. What was so secret about that? My Lord Dragon, Lord Davram has returned. It was Elza Penfell. who escorted Bashir into the barn. She was a handsome woman in a dark green riding dress. Her brown eyes seemed to grow feverish when they found Rand. She, at least, was one he did not have to worry about. Elsa was fanatical in her devotion. "Thank you, Elsa," he said. "Best you return to help with the cleanup. There's a long way to go yet." Her mouth tightened slightly, and her gaze took in everyone from Cadswain to the Ogier with an air of jealousy before she offered a curtsy and left. Yes, fanatical was the word. Bashir was a short, slender man in a gold-worked gray coat with the ivory baton of the Marshal General of Sardinia, tipped with a golden wolf's head, tucked behind his belt opposite his sword. His baggy trousers were tucked into turned-down boots that had been waxed till they shone despite a light splattering of mud. His recent work had required as much formality and dignity as he could supply, and he could supply a great deal. Even the Seanchan must have heard his reputation by now. Gray streaked his black hair and the thick mustaches that curled around his mouth like downturned horns. Dark-tilted eyes sad, he walked right past Rand with the rolling gait of a man more accustomed to a saddle than his own feet. Walked slowly along the line of dead men, staring intently at each face. Impatient as Rand was, he gave him his time to mourn. "I've never seen anything like what's outside," Bashir said quietly as he walked. "A big raid out of the Blight is 1,000 Trollocs. Most are only a few hundred. Ah, Cocoon, you never did guard your left the way you should. Even then, you need to outnumber them 3 or 4 times to be assured you won't go into their cookpots. Out there, I think I saw a foreshadowing of Tarmangaiden. A small part of Tarmangaiden. Let's hope it really is the last battle. If we live through that, I don't think we'll ever want to see another. We will, though. There's always another battle. I suppose that will be the case until the whole world turns tinker." At the end of the row, he stopped in front of a man whose face was split almost down to his luxuriant black beard. Oscan here had a bright future ahead of him, but you could say the same of a lot of dead men. Sighing heavily, he turned to face Rand. "The Daughter of the Nine Moons will meet you in 3 days at a manor house in northern Altara, near the border of Andor." He touched the breast of his coat. "I have a map. She's already near there somewhere, but they say it isn't in lands they control. When it comes to secrecy, these Seanchan make Aes Sedai look as open as village girls." Cadswain snorted. "You suspect a trap?" Loghain eased his sword in its scabbard, perhaps unconsciously. Bashir made a dismissive gesture, but he eased his sword too. "I always suspect a trap. It isn't that. The High Lady Surath still didn't want me or Manfor to talk to anyone but her. Not anyone. Our servants were mutes, just as when we went to Abu Dar with Loyal."
Mine had had her tongue cut out,
Loyal said in tones of disgust, his ears tilting back. His knuckles paled on the haft of his axe. Ammon made a shocked sound, his ears going stiff as fence posts. "Altara just crowned a new king," Bashir went on. "But everybody in the Terracin Palace seemed to be walking on eggshells and looking over their shoulders, Seanchan and Altaran alike. Even Surath looked as though she felt a sword hovering above her neck." "Maybe they're frightened of Tarmangaiden," Rand said. "Or the Dragon Reborn. I'll have to be careful. Frightened people do stupid things. What are the arrangements, Bashir?" The Saldaean pulled the map from inside his coat and walked back to Rand, unfolding it. "They're very precise. She will bring 6 Suldam and Damani, but no other attendants." Olivia made a noise like an angry cat, and he blinked before going on, no doubt uncertain of a freed Damani, to say the least. "You can bring 5 people who can channel. She'll assume any man with you can, but you can bring a woman who can't to make the honors even." Min was suddenly at Rand's side, wrapping her arm around his. "No," he said firmly. He was not about to take her into a possible trap. "We'll talk about it," she murmured, the bond filling with stubborn resolve. The most dire words a woman can say, short of "I'm going to kill you," Rand thought. Suddenly he felt a chill. Had it been him? Or Luce Theron? The madman chuckled softly in the back of his head. No matter. In 3 days, one difficulty would be resolved. One way or another. What else, Bashir?
Lifting the damp cloth that lay across her eyes, carefully so she did not catch the bracelet and rings Angreal in her hair. She wore that and her jeweled Turangreal every waking moment now. Nynaeve sat up on the edge of her bed. With men needing healing from dreadful wounds, some missing a hand or an arm, it had seemed petty to ask men for a headache. But the willow bark seemed to have worked as well, only more slowly. One of her rings, set with a pale green stone that now appeared to glow with a faint internal light, seemed to vibrate continually on her finger, though it did not really move. The pattern of vibrations was mixed, a reaction to Sidar and Saidin being channeled outside. For that matter, someone could have been channeling inside. Catswain was sure it should be able to indicate direction, but she could not say how. Ha! For Catswain and her supposed superior knowledge. She wished she could say that to the woman's face. It was not that Catswain intimidated her. Certainly not. She stood above Catswain. Just that she wanted to maintain some degree of harmony. That was the reason she held her tongue around the woman. The rooms she shared with Lan were spacious but also drafty, with no casement fitting its window properly, and over the generations the house had settled enough that the doors had been trimmed so they could close all the way, making more gaps to let every breeze whistle through. The fire on the stone hearth danced as though it were outdoors, crackling and spitting sparks. The carpet, so faded she could no longer really make out the pattern, had more holes burned in it than she could count. The bed with its heavy bedposts and worn canopy was large and sturdy, but the mattress was lumpy. The pillows held more feathers that poked through than they did down, and the blankets seemed almost more darns than original material. But Lan shared the rooms, and that made all the difference. That made them a palace. He stood at one of the windows where he had been since the attack began, staring down now at the work going on outside. Or perhaps studying the slaughter yard the manor house grounds had become. It was so still he might have been a statue, a tall man in a well-fitting dark green coat, his shoulders broad enough to make his waist appear slender, with the leather cord of his hadori holding back his shoulder-length hair, black, tinged with white at the temples. A hard-faced man, yet beautiful. In her eyes he was. Let anyone else say what they would. Only they had best not say it in her hearing. Even Catswain. A ring bearing a flawless sapphire was cold on her right hand. It seemed more likely he was feeling anger than hostility. That ring did have a flaw in her estimation. It was all very well to know someone nearby was feeling angry or hostile, but that did not mean the emotion was directed at you. "It's time for me to go back outside and lend a hand again," she said as she stood. "Not yet," he told her without turning from the window. Ring or no ring, his deep voice was calm and quite firm. "Moiraine used to say a headache was sign she'd been channeling too much. That's dangerous." Her hand strayed toward her braid before she could snatch it down again, as if he knew more about channeling than she. Well, in some ways he did. 20 years as Moiraine's warder had taught him as much as a man could know of Sidar. "My headache is completely gone. I'm perfectly all right now." "Don't be petulant, my love. There are only a few hours till twilight. Plenty of work will be left tomorrow." His left hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, relaxed, tightened. Only that hand moved. Her lips compressed. "Petulant?" She smoothed her skirt furiously. She was not petulant. He seldom invoked his right to command in private. Curse those sea folk for ever thinking of such a thing. But when he did, the man was unbending. Of course she could go anyway. He would not try to stop her physically. She was certain of that. Fairly certain. Only she did not intend to violate her marriage vows in the slightest way, even if she did want to kick her beloved husband's shins. Kicking her skirts instead, she went to stand beside him at the window and slip her arm through his. His arm was rock hard, though. His muscles were hard, wonderfully so, but this was the hardness of tension, as though he were straining to lift a great weight. How she wished she had his bond, to give her hints of what was troubling him. And she laid hands on Mirelle. No, best not to think of that hussy. Greens. They simply could not be trusted with men. Outside, not far from the house, she could see a pair of those black-coated Ashaman, and the sisters bonded to them. She had avoided that whole lot as much as possible. The Ashaman for obvious reasons, the sisters because they supported Elida. Yet you could not spend time in the same house with people, even a house as large and rambling as Algarin's, and avoid coming to recognize them. Arl Malavin was a Kyrianan who seemed even wider than he actually was, because he stood barely chest-high to Lan. Donalo Sandomir, a tyrant with a garnet in his left ear, and his grey-streaked beard trimmed to a point and oiled, although she doubted very much that his creased, leathery face belonged to a noble. Malavin had bonded Iceling Noon, a fierce-eyed green, who peppered her speech with borderland oaths that sometimes made Lan wince. Nynaeve wished she understood them, but he refused to explain. Sandomir's captive was Ayako Nosoni, a diminutive white with wavy waist-length black hair, who was nearly as brown-skinned as a Damani. She seemed shy, a rarity among Aes Sedai. Both women wore their fringed shawls. The captives almost always did, perhaps as gestures of defiance. But then they seemed to get on strangely well with the men. Often Nynaeve had seen them chatting companionably, hardly the behavior of defiant prisoners, and she suspected that Loghain and Gabrella were not the only pair sharing a bed outside wedlock. It was disgraceful. Suddenly fires bloomed below, 6 enveloping dead Trollocs in front of Malavin and Iceling, 7 in front of Sandomir and Ayako, and she squinted against the blinding glare. It was like trying to look at 13 noonday suns blazing in a cloudless sky. They were linked. She could tell from the way the flows of Sidar moved, stiffly, as though they were being forced into place rather than guided. Or rather, the men were trying to force them. That never worked with the female half of the power. It was pure fire, and the blazes were ferocious, fiercer than she would have expected from fire alone. But of course they would be using Sidene as well, and who could say what they were adding from that murderous chaos? The little she could recall of being linked with Rand left her with no desire ever again to go near that. In just a few minutes the fires vanished, leaving only low heaps of grayish ash lying on seared earth that looked hard and cracked. That could not do the soil much good. "You can't find this very entertaining, Lan. What are you thinking?" "Idle thoughts," he said, his arm hard as stone beneath her hand. New fires flared outside. "Share them with me." She managed to put a hint of question in that. He seemed amused by the nature of their vows, yet he absolutely refused to follow the smallest instruction when they were alone. Requests he granted instantly, well, most of the time, but the man would quietly leave his boots muddy till the mud flaked off if she told him not to track in mud. "Unpleasant thoughts, but if you wish. The Myrddraal and Trollocs make me think of Tarmon Guyton." "Unpleasant thoughts indeed." Still staring out the window, he nodded. There was no expression on his face. Lan could teach Aes Sedai about hiding emotions, but a touch of heat entered his voice. "It's coming soon, Nynaeve. Yet Althor seems to think he has forever to dance with the Seanchan. Shadow Spawn could be moving down through the blight while we stand here, down through—" His mouth snapped shut. "Down through Malkir," he'd almost said. Dead Malkir, the murdered land of his birth. She was sure of it. He went on as if he had not paused. "They could strike at Shinar, at the whole borderlands, next week, or tomorrow. And Althor sits weaving his Seanchan schemes. He should send someone to convince King Isar and the others to return to their duty along the blight. He should be marshalling all the force he can gather and taking it to the Blight. The last battle will be there, and at Shayol Ghul. The war is there." Sadness welled up in her, yet she managed to keep it out of her voice. "You have to go back," she said quietly. At last he turned his head, frowning down at her. His clear blue eyes were so cold. They held less of death than they had, of that she was certain, but they were still so cold. "My place is with you, heart of my heart, ever and always." She gathered all of her courage and held on to it hard, so hard that she ached. She wanted to speak fast, to get the words out before courage failed, but she forced herself to a steady tone and an even pace. "A borderland saying I heard from you once. Death is lighter than a feather, duty heavier than a mountain. My duty lies here, making sure Olivia doesn't kill Rand. But I will take you to the borderlands. Your duty lies there. You want to go to Shinar? You mentioned King Isar and Shinar, and it is close to Malkir." He looked down at her for a long time, but at last he exhaled softly, and the tension left his arm. "Are you sure, Nynaeve? If you are, then yes, Shinar. In the Trolloc Wars, the Shadow used Tarwin's Gap to move large numbers of Trollocs, just as it did a few years back when we sought the Eye of the World. But only if you are completely sure." No, she was not sure. She wanted to cry, to scream at him that he was a fool, that his place was with her, not dying alone in a futile private war with the Shadow. Only she could not say any of that. Bond or no bond, she knew he was torn inside, torn between his love of her and his duty, torn and bleeding as surely as if he had been stabbed with a sword. She could not add to his wounds. She could try to make sure he survived, though. "Would I make the offer if I wasn't sure?" she said dryly, surprised at how calm she sounded. "I won't like sending you away, but you have your duty, and I have mine." Wrapping his arms around her, he hugged her to his chest, gently at first, then harder, until she thought he might squeeze all the air from her lungs. She did not care. She hugged him just as fiercely, and had to pry her hands from his broad back when she was done at last. Like she wanted to weep, and knew she must not. As he began packing his saddlebags, she hurriedly changed into a riding dress of yellow-slashed green silk and stout leather shoes, then slipped from the room before he was done. Aldarin's library was large, a square, high-ceilinged room, lined with shelves. Half a dozen cushioned chairs stood scattered around the floor, and a long table and a tall map rack completed the furnishings. The stone hearth was cold, and the iron stand lamps unlit, but she channeled briefly to light 3 of them. A hasty search found the maps she needed in the rack's diamond-shaped compartments. They were as old as most of the books, yet the land did not change greatly in 200 or 300 years. When she returned to their rooms, Lan was in the sitting room, saddlebags on his shoulder, Warder's color-shifting cloak hanging down his back. His face was still, a stone mask. She took only time to get her own cloak, blue silk lined with velvet, and they walked in silence, her right hand resting lightly on his left wrist, out to the dimly lit stable where their horses were kept. The air there smelled of hay and horses and horse dung, as it always did in stables. A lean, balding groom with a nose that had been broken more than once sighed when Lan told him they wanted Landarb and Lover's Knot saddled. A gray-haired woman began work on Nynaeve's stout brown mare, while 3 of the aging men made a job of getting Lan's tall black stallion bridled and out of his stall. "I want a promise from you," Nynaeve said quietly as they waited. Mandarb danced in circles, so that the plump fellow trying to lift the saddle onto the stallion's back had to run trying to catch up. "An oath. I mean it, Lan Mandragoran. We aren't alone any longer." "What do you want my oath on?" he asked warily. The balding groom called for 2 more men to help. "That you'll ride to Falmoran before you enter the Blight, and that if anyone wants to ride with you, you'll let him." His smile was small and sad. "I've always refused to lead men into the Blight, Nynaeve. There were times men rode with me, but I would not. If men have ridden with you before, she cut in, men can ride with you again. Your oath on it, or I vow I'll let you ride the whole long way to Shinar. The woman was fastening the cinches on Lover's Knot's saddle, but the three men were still struggling to get Mandarp's saddle on his back, to keep him from shaking off the saddle blanket. How far south in Shinar do you mean to leave me? He asked. When she said nothing, he nodded. Very well, Nynaeve, if that's what you want. I swear it under the light and by my hope of rebirth and salvation. It was very hard not to sigh with relief. She had managed it, and without lying. She was trying to do as Egwene wanted and behave as though she had already taken the 3 oaths on the oath rod. But it was very hard dealing with a husband if you could not lie, even when it was absolutely necessary. Kiss me, she told him, adding hastily, that wasn't an order. I just want to kiss my husband. A goodbye kiss. There would be no time for one later. In front of everyone, he said, laughing. You've always been so shy about that. The woman was nearly done with Lover's Knot, and one of the grooms was holding Mandarp as steady as he could, while the other 2 hurriedly buckled the cinches. They're too busy to see anything. Kiss me, or I'll think you're the one who's... His lips on hers shut off words. Her toes curled. Some time later she was leaning on his broad chest to catch her breath while he stroked her hair. Perhaps we can have one last night together in Shinar, he murmured softly. It may be some time before we're together again, and I'll miss having my back clawed. Her face grew hot, and she pushed away from him unsteadily. The grooms were done and staring very pointedly at the straw-covered floor, but they might well be close enough to overhear. I think not. She was proud that she did not sound breathless. I don't want to leave Rand alone with Olivia that long. He trusts her, Nynaeve. I don't understand it, but there it is, and that's all that matters. She sniffed, as if any man knew what was good for him. Her stout mare whickered uneasily as they rode among dead trollocs to a patch of ground not far from the stable that she knew well enough to weave a gateway. Mandarp, a trained warhorse,